The September 11th attacks are some of the most infamous, important, and scrutinized events in American history. The tragic stories of survival and heroism never seem to cease being revealed as the years go on, and the impact that single day had on the country and the world will never be forgotten. Needless to say, the event has been studied and examined to no end. A natural consequence of such an insane, impactful, and partially mysterious event is the existence of conspiracy theories surrounding it. In this video, we'll be examining an iceberg chart that displays a host of these theories that range from, quote, the plausible to the insane. It should be noted that this video does not in any way support or endorse these theories at all. Most, if not all, of the theories presented in this iceberg are demonstrably untrue and do nothing but muddy the waters of the truth regarding the events. That being said, this video is entirely for educational purposes, and all due respect to the victims of the attacks will constantly be in mind. Government involvement. This first entry essentially sets the stage for the entire world of 9/11 conspiracy theories. The phrase government involvement is extremely vague and nondescript, but in this context, it refers to the idea that the United States government was involved in the planning and execution of the attacks in some form or fashion. As is common with conspiracy theories, a general distrust of the government and an exploitation of the so-called suspicious elements of the official 9/11 story lead many to believe that the government is to blame for the attacks. This entry is really just an umbrella concept that covers every possible theory. Not every theory is compatible with one another, and the extent or form of government involvement is not identical in every theory. Rather than dwelling too long on this particular entry, we will see how the idea manifests throughout the entire iceberg. Jet fuel can't melt steel beams. The phrase jet fuel can't melt steel beams is one of the oldest and most widely used mantras in the realm of the so-called 9/11 truthers. Phrases like this have become so ubiquitous and well-known that they are familiar even to those who have no knowledge of the vast world of conspiracy theories, and they have even appeared frequently in popular media and internet memes. This first one is in reference to what is probably the most repeated fact about 9/11 from those who doubt the official story. As everyone is aware, both the South and the North Towers collapsed on the morning of September 11th, just shortly after they were struck by American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175. As if the images of planes striking the buildings were not shocking enough, the view of the towers collapsing seems to be just as memorable and nightmarish. What is most unbelievable to the average person is that such large and seemingly sturdy buildings could be wiped off the map by nothing more than a plane crash, as if that isn't damaging enough. Ignoring the scientific facts, natural intuition may find this hard to comprehend. The fact most commonly cited to ignite suspicion in the official story is that, truthfully, jet fuel is not capable of burning at a high enough temperature to cause steel to melt. It is true that steel melts at a temperature of about 2500 degrees Fahrenheit, and that jet fuel only burns as high as 800 to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. However, not only does this commonly parroted observation ignore the fact that there has never been any evidence or official report of steel even melting at all during the attack, it also ignores the fact that steel becomes weak and malleable at a far lower temperature, losing half its strength at just 1100 to 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. To put this into perspective, the Inferno burned up to as high as 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, more than hot enough to weaken the structural integrity and cause the structure to sag inwards, which eventually caused it to collapse and essentially pancake downwards to the ground. This is made especially evident when the actual design of the building is examined, having one single giant core structure running through the center of the building all the way to the top. This core was surrounded by the many floors made of lightweight steel and concrete, balanced by both the center core and the exterior columns that lined all four sides of the building. When the core and floor structures around the impact zone burned enough to bend beyond a sustainable point, the towers collapsed in on themselves. From certain video angles, the building core can actually be seen remaining up for several seconds, while the rest has already completely collapsed. While the phrase is catchy and has reached verifiable meme status because of its constant use, the truth is that it does not hold up to scrutiny and is ultimately ignorant of the facts. The statement is absolutely true: jet fuel can't melt steel beams, but the steel did not melt, and jet fuel can absolutely bend steel beams. Bush did 9/11. Perhaps even more than the first phrase, Bush did 9/11 is easily one of, if not the, most repeated conspiracy theory related phrases connected to the event. Unlike the jet fuel phrase, it does not exploit any particular piece of so-called evidence, but is rather a general declaration of belief in Bush's involvement in the attacks. Naturally, those who believe the government was involved in the attacks believe that specifically the Bush administration orchestrated them. This is also a sort of umbrella phrase that doesn't say too much about what specifically the person who says it believes, but it is likewise based on generally faulty and non-existent evidence. Controlled demolition. This one kind of builds on the jet fuel can't melt steel beams concept by directly stating that the tower's collapse was in fact not due to the extremely high temperatures within the infernos caused by the jet fuel and other flammable materials, but rather due to intentionally placed explosive devices throughout the building. The idea of a controlled demolition is another umbrella term that covers a number of different theories about exactly how such a thing was accomplished. The general idea is that since it is so obviously implausible for the towers to collapse because of, an entire plane exploding inside of them, there simply had to have been other factors in place that caused the structure to be destroyed. This theory also gets a lot of its strength from natural intuition because of the fact that the collapse of the buildings look remarkably similar to actual controlled demolitions of buildings on construction sites. While this seems intriguing at first, it really doesn't indicate what people think it does. Simply put, I'm not sure how else a building of that size and shape is supposed to collapse. There's really no other way for a building of that kind to collapse besides falling over sideways, which would be nearly impossible for anything to accomplish. Buildings collapse downwards, imploding in on themselves. That's just how they fall. Besides the general visual similarities, the differences are deal-breaking. Actual controlled demolitions involve multiple different explosions all at once to cause a swift and, controlled collapse. No such explosions can be seen or heard when either of the towers collapsed. Regardless of all of that, we will discuss some of the specific theories as the iceberg goes on. No planes. This is notoriously one of the most ridiculous 9/11 conspiracy theories. As insane as this sounds, a shocking amount of people advocate this theory online. Like the others in this tier, this is an umbrella theory that covers a number of ideas. For some, it's not that there were no planes at all, but that they weren't passenger planes. Some say they were missiles or drones. The worst of all of them is the theory that the planes were all CGI. Yes, CGI. We will get deeper into these theories as the iceberg goes on, but just know that there is a whole list of theories that try to come up with alternate explanations rather than the obvious fact that planes were involved. Osama bin Laden U.S. government connections. This entry runs deeper and is involved in more genuine historical inquiry than most of the others on this list. Essentially, this stems originally from the US support for Afghan rebels during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s. The US funded a rebel group called the Mujahideen, supplying them with weapons to fight against the Soviets. Unsurprisingly, after the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan, the Afghan forces didn't exactly feel like reciprocating the love. This support from the US, according to some, inadvertently gave power to later groups like the Taliban and, of course, Al-Qaeda. This theory goes beyond the realm of 9/11 truthers and lies in more mainstream and legitimate discussions, less about the intentional actions of the government and more about the possible culpability of the United States in accidentally creating these groups. Currently, the official story is that the United States government had no direct part in creating or funding Al-Qaeda, but that is a more complicated issue. From this more nuanced debate comes the idea that the United States, directly or indirectly, funded and supported the rise and operation of Osama bin Laden. More than that, there are those who believe the US government directly worked with bin Laden to orchestrate the 9/11 attacks. More theories on exactly how this is proposed to have worked will show up later. Naturally, those who believe that the attacks were an inside job must have some explanation for the role of the terrorists and bin Laden, specifically regarding how much communication and information sharing existed between them and the US government. Foreknowledge. This is one of the most vague yet captivating theories presented about the attacks. This simply refers to the idea that there existed parties that had foreknowledge about the attacks, yet did nothing to stop them. As we go on through the iceberg, this idea in various forms may not be too far-fetched, but the extent to which foreknowledge existed in any party, especially the US government, is nowhere near what many truthers assert. It is believed by some that the United States, particularly those in the Bush administration, were aware of the attacks being planned and did nothing to stop them to justify the war on terror. Others argue that other parties had foreknowledge as well and did nothing so as to reap whatever benefits applied to them. There are many factors that contribute to people believing certain groups had foreknowledge about the attacks, and some of those will be discussed throughout this chart. Cruise missile hit the Pentagon. To start off Layer 2, we have one of the most well-known theories regarding the attacks on the locations other than the World Trade Center. As discussed in Layer 1, there are those who believe that no planes were involved in the attacks, and the Pentagon is one of the alleged proofs of this fact. The theory stems from two major points. 1. There is no clear footage of a plane hitting the Pentagon, and 2. The impact zone does not look like a plane crash. When it comes to the 9/11 attacks, everyone is familiar with the seemingly endless amount of footage of the towers, especially following the first plane strike. However, the other two attack sites are not known for their impressive recordings. There are only a few videos of the actual plane impact at the Pentagon, all of which are very low-resolution security camera recordings. Despite the plane being visible in these recordings, people deny that the footage is sufficient enough to prove that there was an actual plane. Not only are there these videos, but there are many eyewitness accounts that all corroborate the fact that a plane barreled out of the sky and dove into the side of the building, flying right over the freeway and actually clipping lamp poles with its wings as it rode over the landscape. It is also claimed that the impact zone does not look like a plane crash, with some even going as far as to say that there were no plane parts at the site at all. This is simply untrue. There were countless pieces of the shredded jet littering the crash site. The odd, seemingly controlled look of the impact zone is actually because the section of the Pentagon that was hit had recently been renovated with new fire protection measures, making the fire caused by the explosion to be far smaller and spread far less. Essentially, these two misconceptions about the attack lead people to believe it was simply not a plane. In fact, there are those who argue it could not have been a plane anyway, calling the maneuver of bringing it so low to the ground and hitting the side of the building impossible. That being said, seeing that the Pentagon was obviously hit by something, theorists argue that it was some kind of directed missile. This is one of the most common theories about the attacks and is believed, like most others, based on nothing but simple ignorance of pretty basic facts. Insider trading foreknowledge. Shortly before the 9/11 attacks, there was a genuinely unusual pattern in the stock market for shares related to both American and United Airlines. Mindy Kleinberg, a member of the 9/11 Family Steering Committee, an organization set up to monitor the 9/11 Commission as part of the 9/11 Truth Movement, reported to the Commission in 2003, "Never before on the Chicago Exchange were such large amounts of United and American Airlines options traded. These investors netted a profit of at least $5 million after the September 11th attacks. Interestingly, the names of the investors remain undisclosed, and the $5 million remains unclaimed in the Chicago Exchange account." Essentially, the claim is that it appears that there were some stock traders that may have had insider knowledge about the coming attacks that involved American and United Airlines, and traded accordingly so as to profit off the attacks. As interesting as this seems, the report ultimately concluded that there were no legitimate connections between these tradings and any knowledge of the attacks. The 9/11 Commission report addresses the issue as such. Highly publicized allegations of insider trading in advance of 9/11 generally rest on reports of unusual pre-9/11 trading activity in companies whose stock plummeted after the attacks. Some unusual trading did in fact occur, but each such trade proved to have an innocuous explanation. For example, the volume of put options, investments that pay off only when a stock drops in price, surged in the parent companies of United Airlines on September 6th and American Airlines on September 10th. Highly suspicious trading on its face. Yet, further investigation has revealed that the trading had no connection with 9/11. A single US-based institutional investor with no conceivable ties to Al-Qaeda purchased 95% of the UAL puts on September 6th as part of a trading strategy that also included buying 115,000 shares of American on September 10th. Similarly, much of the seemingly suspicious trading in American on September 10th was traced to a specific US-based options trading newsletter, faxed to its subscribers on Sunday, September 9th, which recommended these trades. These examples typify the evidence examined by the investigation. The SEC and the FBI, aided by other agencies and the securities industry, devoted enormous resources to investigating this issue, including securing the cooperation of many foreign governments. These investigators have found that the apparently suspicious consistently proved innocuous. Flight 93 crash site. Similar to the Pentagon-related theories, the Flight 93 crash site serves as fuel for theories about the plane's fate differing from the official story. The story of United Airlines Flight 93 is one of mystery and heroism. It's unknown exactly what the intended target for the flight was, but judging on its path, it's generally believed it was headed for DC, perhaps the White House or the Capitol. The plane fortunately never reached its target, instead crashing in an empty field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Based on a phone call with a 9/11 operator made by passenger Todd Beamer from the plane and the surviving black box recording, it appears multiple passengers were able to storm their way into the cockpit, which led to the hijackers crashing the plane directly downwards to end their botched mission. Most people know this story and are familiar with this fourth plane that never made it to its destination. All of that being said, the crash site of Flight 93 has been highly scrutinized by theorists. There is absolutely zero footage of the plane crashing, and the crash site itself is easily the most perplexing at first glance. Most photos and videos of the crash site do not contain any discernible signs of a plane at all, leading many to be suspicious. Similar to the Pentagon, people seem to naturally expect that a plane crash will always look something like the corpse of an animal, large parts, and a general skeleton left over. Most plane crashes that look like this do so because they were crash landings rather than head-on collisions. Planes, when they unintentionally crash, are typically not smashing nose first into a hard surface. Such was not the case at the Pentagon, and even more so for Flight 93. Flight 93 crashed downwards at a near 90-degree angle at almost 600 miles per hour. The plane quite literally burrowed into the ground, leaving practically no obvious plane debris above the ground. Even the government officials that arrived first on the scene were baffled at the lack of any major plane parts. There is footage, however, that clearly shows the shape of a plane's silhouette smashed into the ground, very much like World War II kamikaze pockmarks on the sides of battleships. Like the other entries in these first few tiers, this is just a general observation that ties into a number of other theories that will be in the rest of the iceberg. There are several alternate stories that people have devised to explain the fate of Flight 93. Most of these theories are based off of the peculiar appearance of the crash site, but it's not really anything to be confused about. Some even go as far as to say that the crash site itself is a missile impact crater, implying the existence of the plane itself was falsified, and the passengers, their phone calls, and the black box recording are all fabricated. Many plane parts were obviously found and documented, yet there still remains other theories which we will get to. Holograms. This is easily one of the most laughable theories that fall under the no planes umbrella. Somehow there are people who claim the planes were literally holograms, with some going as far as to say that the very explosions and subsequent destruction seen at the World Trade Center were completely holographic. There really isn't much to say about this particular entry, considering it's pretty self-explanatorily awful. Essentially, the idea is that the planes weren't real and that the animated holograms were projected to coincide with the explosions in both of the towers, which conveniently carved plane-shaped holes in the buildings and launched plane parts across downtown Manhattan. I understand the desire to be skeptical about things and the belief in certain theories to an extent, but this one has to be one of the worst and most mind-boggling ideas about anything ever. The new Pearl Harbor. In 1997, a group was formed by several conservative politicians, including Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, called the Project for the New American Century. Its goal was to influence a shift in American foreign policy towards greater strength and overseas presence, particularly in the Middle East. The group was gunning specifically for the removal of Saddam Hussein from power. In September of 2000, the group published a report titled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. It is a long and detailed report advocating for a large number of changes in American foreign policy, especially as it relates to military force. In Section 5 of the report, the preservation and increase of military dominance is discussed. The report argues that the United States must increase funding for military research and development due to the growing and ever-changing technological environment. The report admits that this process will likely be a slow one if it were to happen, unless there was, quote, some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. This phrase has become infamous in hindsight because of its near-prophetic accuracy. The United States would indeed be moved to a highly assertive presence in the Middle East thanks to a previously unthinkable attack on domestic soil, just as the US was moved to join the Second World War following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Due to multiple members of the PNAC ending up in the Bush administration and both the report's predictions and desires coming to fruition, it is theorized by some that the report was a kind of warning from the powers that be that something was coming. While there is no doubt that the September 11th attacks in many ways mirror the Pearl Harbor attack, and that the attacks were used to justify a large-scale involvement in the Middle East, similarly to how Pearl Harbor was used to justify full-scale involvement in World War II, this need not be as conspiratorial as many would like to claim. It is not an insane thing to say that a Pearl Harbor-like event, if it were to happen, would cause sudden and rapid military action and development. The same could be said about today, as it can be said in all generations. It was simply true that an unanticipated attack on American soil was a possibility at the time, and if it happened, it would introduce a new necessity for dominance over whatever region or country was behind the attacks. Obviously, the response to the 9/11 attacks and the response to the Pearl Harbor attack are not identical, but the comparison is not only valid, but was made before the attacks even occurred. This eerily accurate prediction being made by those who themselves advocated for and then implemented the very militaristic change brought about by the actualization of said prediction is, needless to say, unnerving. However, the report's prediction truly was a self-fulfilling, conditional, yet inevitable prophecy that could have been made by anyone, and it was made by those who were planning on using the upcoming Republican administration to begin implementing these very policies, regardless if any attack occurred. Even so, this is one of the more disturbing facts about the attacks, as one does not need to delve into theories of conspiracy to recognize the eerie nature of the prediction. This phrase from the PNAC document inspired the title of the 2004 book by David Ray Griffin, The New Pearl Harbor, Disturbing Questions About the Bush Administration and 9/11. The book argues that the Bush administration had knowledge of the attacks and that they were exploited to justify the preceding wars. The book was among the list of reading material made available to the members of the 9/11 Commission and was even found on bin Laden's bookshelf during the raid in 2011. Bin Laden's CIA training. This is a more specific theory under the umbrella of the connections between bin Laden and the US government. The claim is that bin Laden specifically was on the payroll of the CIA and was trained along with his troops by American agents. A 2004 BBC article stated that some analysts believe bin Laden himself had security training from the CIA. Robin Cook, the British Foreign Secretary from 1997 to 2001, called bin Laden a product of a monumental miscalculation by Western security agencies, and told The Guardian, throughout the 80s he was armed by the CIA and funded by the Saudis to wage jihad against the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. A number of other sources claim that there were essentially direct ties between CIA officials and bin Laden that were created in order to support the Afghans in their war against the Soviets. Claims that bin Laden expressed appreciation for American aid made it to as mainstream of a platform as Larry King Live, when the former Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States said as much on the program. It should be noted that these claims do not implicate the kind of conspiratorial notions that many people would like them to. The people who made these claims about bin Laden's connections to the CIA were not intending to say that the CIA was training bin Laden to perform terrorist attacks against the United States. Rather, these claims were made either to express sorrow over the change in bin Laden's loyalty, so to speak, or, and perhaps most of all, to highlight the incompetence of the CIA, funding what would later become the United States' most wanted enemy. While the latter is an opinion held by some theorists, many others believe the totally unbacked idea that such ties, if they truly existed, resulted in intentional cooperation between the CIA and bin Laden in executing the attacks. Multiple former CIA employees have since denied from personal experience and memory the existence of any ties between the US and any forces other than the local Afghan people, citing that bin Laden was never even mentioned, and that there was no need for help from anyone other than the Afghan people who were, quote, all too willing to fight. However, there are uncontested instances of the CIA supporting or funding other people who had ties to bin Laden. One of these men was Omar Abdel-Rahman, who was given visas to the US by the CIA 4 times and acted as a recruiter for the Afghan-Soviet War. He was involved in the planning of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. While the claim that the CIA had ties to bin Laden in the 1980s ended up as a kind of he said, she said situation, neither option indicates that the CIA intentionally worked with bin Laden to carry out any attacks. At best, we have no ties at all, and at worst, we have the US unintentionally supporting what would later become their greatest enemy. Not that the latter is very good, but even if that's true, it simply does not equal the CIA intentionally forming Al-Qaeda and planning the 9/11 attacks with bin Laden, all of which is something that many theorists actually claim. Wolfgang Staley photos. Wolfgang Staley is a German video artist most famous for capturing one of the only 3 recordings of the North Tower being hit by Flight 11. His recording is technically a collection of pictures, as he had set up in his Brooklyn apartment 2 cameras that took pictures of the Manhattan area every 4 seconds. This was part of an art project that was actually intended to demonstrate the calm, mundane daily life of New York City. While it is technically not a video, the frames can obviously be strung together to create a kind of stop motion, showing the plane approaching and the large explosion upon impact. This is the clearest and widest angle of the North Tower being hit, and was previously only able to be viewed at the 9/11 Memorial Museum in Manhattan. This entry isn't a conspiracy theory, but it is definitely one of the lesser known pieces of footage of the attacks. New World Order. The New World Order is a concept which extends far beyond the theories about the September 11th attacks, yet no iceberg such as this is complete without a reference to it. The New World Order, or NWO, is the name for an alleged plan created by the global elites to bring the entire world under the control of a new totalitarian regime. The concept is connected to a massive amount of theories and ideas, all of which have to do with the bringing about of massive political change, resulting in the complete subjugation of the whole planet via the actualization of the desires of a comparatively small group of powerful individuals. Naturally, such an idea is theorized not to happen overnight, but through gradual change that eventually causes amongst the world population a perceived need for a global government. One of the events that is commonly brought up as an example of one of these gradual changes that create a perceived need for massive change in global policy is, of course, the September 11th attacks. Whether such a theory has substantial evidence or not, the fact is that the attacks absolutely revolutionized many things about the world order, particularly when it comes to travel and the United States' role as a sort of global police via the War on Terror. There did come about a kind of new world order, so to speak, because of the attacks, although not in the sense that most theorists mean. Essentially, people theorize that the attacks, whether planned by these mysterious global elites or not, were exploited to introduce new global policies that propel the New World Order agenda further along via the intensified travel security measures and, most of all, the subsequent passing of the Patriot Act. This entry is one of the big ones, the end of the proverbial rabbit hole for almost any conspiracy. How it connects to the attacks is different depending on who you ask, and the evidence for such claims is largely, if not entirely, based on pure speculation rather than any hard evidence. But that is a much larger conversation that goes beyond the purview of this video. Emergency Response to Terrorism Self-Study. The Emergency Response to Terrorism Self-Study was a book created by the National Fire Academy and FEMA to train first responders on how to respond to a number of different kinds of terrorist attacks. It provided situational awareness on terrorist tactics and the possible kinds of attacks that might occur in the future. What is most interesting about this booklet is that its cover featured the World Trade Center with a sight aimed at one of the towers, oddly enough right about where the South Tower was hit. However, this isn't really as surprising if you know anything about history. The World Trade Center was, of course, the site of a bombing in 1993. As the book points out, this attack was fresh on the mind of the authorities as well as the Oklahoma City bombing, both of which happened to be vehicle bombings. Interestingly enough, the 1993 attack, which blew a 6-hole story in the North Tower's underground parking garage, injuring 1,042 people and killing 6, was intended to knock over the tower, causing it to crash into the other and topple them both. LOL Superman. One of the largest reasons why the September 11th attacks are so influential to the public consciousness is because of the massive amount of media coverage. 9/11 served not only as a tragedy, but as one broadcast to the entire world, recorded from countless angles. The attacks are so personal to Americans who have never even stepped foot in New York because they were televised and seen live right from people's living rooms. There truly is an untold amount of footage. Naturally, there has been some footage that was shown live or uploaded to the internet that ended up becoming lost. Likely the most famous of all these lost recordings is a video that is known by the unfortunate title, LOL Superman. Those who claim to have seen this lost footage say that it began to circulate online in 2006 tagged with the caption LOL Superman, or something of the sort, an obvious mockery of the men and women forced to jump from the towers and plummet to the ground. The footage was apparently taken from the main plaza and showed people crashing down directly in front of the cameraman's POV. A casual look through YouTube and Reddit posts inquiring about the video's existence and possible whereabouts will show the vast amount of differing opinions about it. There are many who claim to have seen the footage broadcast on the day of the attack, along with many other disturbing scenes never seen again afterwards. There are some who say the video does not exist at all and that it is only an urban legend. Like any piece of lost media, there is a long trail of evidence for it that ultimately leads nowhere. There are supposed clips of the video, supposed origin stories, and even shockingly realistic recreations of the video using computer renderings. People often point to an interview with Werner Herzog in which he was commenting on Timothy Treadwell's death footage as it related to his documentary Grizzly Man. Herzog stated that to use the footage in his documentary would be disrespectful, and he compared it to footage from the 9/11 attacks that he claims was taken by an amateur recorder and showed people crashing down right in front of the camera. He also noted that this footage has never been shown. Whether Herzog has actually seen this footage himself, he doesn't say, and whether or not this footage is the same as the supposed LOL Superman video is totally uncertain. Because of the particularly awful nature of this topic, I'm going to refrain from going any further into the description of this entry. I will leave a link to a video that recaps the story of this lost media in the description. Bank sharply and smash directly, perhaps purposefully, and helicopter video error / nose out theory. This entry refers to a certain clip from the Fox 5 Good Day New York coverage of the events on 9/11. A witness of the first plane from Hoboken, New Jersey, had called into the show and was retelling what he had seen. The anchor went on to remark that the witness, Jim Friedel, claimed that the plane appeared to bank sharply and smash directly, perhaps purposefully. His quotation was cut short as the very moment he says perhaps purposefully, the news chopper camera, which was zoomed in very closely on the towers, captures the second plane jutting into view and striking the South Tower.
Appeared to bank sharply and smash directly, perhaps purposefully, into, oh my goodness.
Oh God.
Now, this may seem relatively unremarkable, but for a handful of reasons, this particular angle of the second plane striking has fallen under the extreme scrutiny of theorists. As discussed earlier in the Iceberg, there are a number of theories that posit that no planes were involved in the attacks. While this seems contrary to all reason, this Good Day New York clip is presented as evidence for the claim that the planes were CGI. Obviously, there are countless recordings from numerous angles of the second plane hitting the South Tower. These fringe theorists argue that every single one of the recordings of the event have been doctored to include a computer-generated plane appearing to strike the tower to make it seem as though the explosion, which they say would have been a triggered explosive device within the building, was caused by this fictional plane. This completely disregards the fact that a huge amount of the recordings of the attack were filmed by random amateurs simply capturing the burning of the North Tower. This would mean that every single one of these recordings were faked and disseminated into the news and the online space by those involved in the conspiracy. This would also mean that the people that claim to have recorded these amateur videos and the people in the videos audibly reacting to the approach and crashing of the plane were all involved in the conspiracy. This would also mean that every single one of the thousands of eyewitnesses who confirmed that it was a plane were involved in the conspiracy. This would mean that the ATC data, the video evidence of the hijackers, and every other piece of verifiable forensic information that undoubtedly proves that what was captured in countless photos and videos was indeed a plane striking the towers is all fake. All that being said, let's look at what in the Good Day New York recording leads people to believe the plane is CGI. The ultimate number one reason is because this certain angle makes it seem as though the nose of the plane protrudes from the other side of the building. The shape of the explosion emerging from the exit wound, so to speak, for a split second looks similar to the nose of a plane. The argument is that this is an error in the compositing of the CGI plane that caused the image to phase through the building and appear on the other side before the explosion fully erupts. Likewise, they also say that the video cutting to black for a moment directly after this was some kind of intentional attempt to cover up the mistake on the part of the news station. Other theories argue a similar case but make the plane a hologram rather than outright CGI, which would explain how it could appear in every video footage taken. We discussed the hologram issue earlier in the Iceberg. I don't know, this one seems pretty self-explanatory. World Trade Center hard drive restoration operation. Shortly after the attacks, the German company Convar was heading a project that attempted to recover the data on hard drives recovered from the wreckage. After recovering data from a number of the drives, the firm came to the conclusion that an unusual amount of trading was done in the time directly before the attack. upwards of $100 million of trades in fact. There were suspicions that these trades may have been made with some foreknowledge of the attacks in the hopes that the records of the trades would be destroyed in the collapse. While no conclusion was ever reached, the 9/11 Commission published a memorandum on information gathered from a briefing with the FBI, which said, "We asked about persistent press reports that certain damaged hard drives had been recovered from the World Trade Center site and sent to Germany, where a company was working to restore them. These press reports contend that large volumes of suspicious transactions flowed through computers housed in the World Trade Center on the morning of 9/11 as part of some illicit but ill-defined effort to profit from the attacks. The assembled agents expressed no knowledge of the reported hard drive recovery effort or the alleged scheme. Moreover, one of the New York agents pointed out from personal experience that everything at the World Trade Center was pulverized, making it extremely unlikely that any hard drive survived to the extent that data could be recovered." $2.3 trillion reported missing by Pentagon. One of the most famous theories is that the September 11th attacks are somehow related to the press conference given by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld on the night of September 10th, 2001. In the press conference, Rumsfeld stated that the DoD was unable to track about $2.3 trillion worth of transactions. People have run wild with this and claim that this was purposefully revealed in the press conference directly before 9/11 so that it would be overshadowed by the attacks and forgotten. There are some major problems with the assumptions here. First of all, people often misconstrue the information. Rumsfeld was not reporting the disappearance of any money, but rather the inability to ensure what said money was actually spent on. He said, "We are, as they say, tangled in our anchor chain. Our financial systems are decades old. According to some estimates, we cannot track 2.3 trillion in transactions." More than that, this information was not novel at the time. The same had been recorded in an audit report in February of 2000 for the fiscal year 1999. The same information was also recorded in a testimony from July of 2000. The unaccounted for money was essentially old news by the time that Rumsfeld mentioned it on September 10th. Moreover, the implication of the theorists here is absurd. This makes the 9/11 attacks either planned or permitted by the United States for the purpose of making people forget about an error in their accounting. Why bring up this apparently scandalous fact the day before the attack if it was so necessary to hide? If the DoD was concerned about covering up this error, why bother reporting it at all? Would it not be easier to simply never report the error rather than report it and then cover it up with the largest terrorist attack in history? And where is the evidence that this is the case? The whole thing seems to be predicated on the seemingly suspicious fact that it was mentioned the night before the attacks. The theories surrounding the $2.3 trillion are all ignorant and unfounded. Similar to the matters like jet fuel can't melt steel beams and Bush did 9/11, bringing up the $2.3 trillion has become a very popular soundbite that offers no substantial evidence for anything and rides entirely on the coincidental and ominous September 10th date. Witness protection. There are various ideas posited by theorists that involve the witness protection program. The one that is probably the most popular is that the jetliners used in the attacks really were commercial planes, but that the passengers aboard were let out at some undisclosed location and placed into the witness protection program so that all of their deaths could be faked. This has got to be one of the worst theories out there. Not only is it devoid of and contrary to literally all evidence, but it is extremely disrespectful to the people who died. I guess the idea is that the government was completely fine with crashing planes into the World Trade Center and killing civilians there, but they drew the line at the passengers of the planes? This is the kind of theory you might see in social media comment sections rather than any remotely respectable place. The 9/11 Commission. The National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, also known as the 9/11 Commission, an independent bipartisan commission created by congressional legislation and the signature of President George W. Bush in late 2002, is chartered to prepare a full and complete account of the circumstances surrounding the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, including preparedness for and the immediate response to the attacks. The commission is also mandated to provide recommendations designed to guard against future attacks. That is the official description of the commission from their own website. In July of 2004, the commission released their report, formerly known as the 9/11 Commission Report. The report acts as the ultimate source of information provided by the United States on the attacks. It provides a play-by-play of the attack, an explanation of how it was conducted, and information about the hijackers and their history, among many other things. Naturally, the report is viewed with skepticism by theorists, as it obviously obviously does not explain the attacks according to their claims of government conspiracy. Similar to the way the Warren Commission report, the report done on the JFK assassination, is viewed in a negative light by theorists, people who are under the impression that the government was behind the attacks are not going to believe the explanation provided by said government. BBC reported World Trade Center 7 collapsed 20 minutes before it fell. This entry refers to an infamous clip from a news report by the BBC that World Trade Center 7, a building within the World Trade Center complex, had collapsed. What is so odd about the report is that it was made with the reporter standing directly in front of a view of the building still clearly standing. And of course the building eventually collapsed roughly a half hour later. Theorists take this as evidence that the so-called script was read too early, indicating that World Trade Center 7 was intentionally demolished, and even that news companies were given the scripts ahead of time. Like most of these theories, while the observation itself may appear odd or out of place upon first glance, the theories that develop from these observations greatly overextend all reasonable speculation. While it is odd that such an obvious and blatant mistake could be made on behalf of the reporters, it's really not as strange as it seems. The BBC later responded saying that they had received the information from an erroneous report just released by the Reuters news agency. A BBC editor in 2007 explained that no such script had been given to them, and that, in the chaos and confusion of the day, I'm quite sure we said things which turned out to be untrue or inaccurate, but at the same time were based on the information we had. Anybody who knows anything about the reporting on the day of the attacks knows how much madness there really was. There were reports of all kinds of things happening that were completely untrue. The World Trade Center 7 report just gets attention because the mistaken reporting ended up being something that actually did happen, though it was technically just misinformation at the time it was reported. Air defense stand-down theory. The air defense stand-down theory claims that the US government ordered the Air Force to stand down on the day of the attacks. The argument is that the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, had the capability and knowledge to identify and shoot down the hijacked planes, but willingly refused so as to let the attacks take place. Obviously, there is absolutely zero evidence of any sort of stand-down order. In fact, what really happened is a lot more complicated than that. Needless to say, the truth is that there was certainly no stand-down order. In reality, the lack of effective military action was due to the mass confusion and lack of proper communication between the different organizations involved. Had there actually been a stand-down order, there would be record of it somewhere, and there would have been no fighters scrambled at all. Obviously, theorists have access to this information and still deny the evidence. Thermite/super thermite controlled demolition. This entry refers to one of the most popular theories regarding the supposed controlled demolition of the World Trade Center. Thermite is a composition of metal and metal oxide that, when ignited, burns at a very high temperature. Nanothermite is the same thing, except the individual pieces of metal and metal oxide are each under 100 nanometers in size. Those who recognize that if the collapse were truly a controlled demolition, there could be no way that large explosive devices could have been planted throughout the building undetected. Instead, it is theorized that nanothermite was somehow discreetly placed in key points throughout the building. This theory was popularized by a 2006 paper published in the Open Chemical Physics Journal by a physicist and early theorist Stephen E. Jones, along with 8 other authors. The paper, titled Active Thermitic Material Discovered in Dust from the 9/11 World Trade Center Catastrophe, claimed that Jones, along with a team of analysts, found evidence of thermite reaction in dust samples from the World Trade Center rubble. The National Institute of Standards and Technology dismissed the claim, arguing that there was no clear proof that the samples were actually taken from the World Trade Center. Jones offered NIST to perform the same tests on their own samples, though they never did. Able Danger. Able Danger was the name of an anti-terrorism military program created in October 1999. The program was designed to examine data and test if careful analysis of information about known and suspected terrorists could be used to determine and predict terrorist activities in order to prevent attacks and destroy known cells. On July 27, 2005, Republican Representative Curt Weldon, who was vice chairman of the House's Armed Service and Homeland Security Committees, spoke to the House about his serious concerns about an apparent failure on the part of the government in stopping the terrorists behind the 9/11 attacks. He was bringing to the House what he had written in his book from May of that year, Countdown to Terror. He claimed that he learned one of our federal agencies had identified the cell of Mohammed Atta before the attacks ever occurred. He claimed that in September of 2000, the federal agency, speaking of the people in charge of Able Danger were planning on involving the FBI in an effort to destroy Atta's cell. Weldon went on to say that the lawyers within the administration at that time denied the agency from involving the FBI and pursuing the cell, apparently out of fear of the then recent Waco incident and because Atta was in the US on a green card. Weldon was not under the impression that some kind of nefarious conspiracy was at work, but was rather convicted by the apparent incompetence and negligence that allowed the Al-Qaeda cell to carry on with their plan. He expressed his confusion about why the 9/11 Commission never investigated the Able Danger situation. He remarked, "Why did the 9/11 Commission not investigate this entire situation? Why did the 9/11 Commission not ask the question about the military's recommendation against the Mohammed Atta cell? Why did the 9/11 Commission not document the internal battles and disputes between agency personnel going after the same terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda? If we are truly going to have an understanding of the need to reform our intelligence system, then we have to be honest with the American people about the past. Never again, Mr. Speaker, can we allow agency bureaucrats to argue over who is going to get the credit for solving the next attack or planned attack against us." Members of the 9/11 Commission would go on to respond to Weldon's claims, one of them saying, "The September 11th Commission did not learn of any U.S. government knowledge prior to 9/11 of surveillance of Mohammed Atta or of his cell. Had we learned of it, it obviously would have been a major focus of our investigation." That was said by Lee Hamilton, and he, along with 9/11 Commission Chairman Thomas Keane, issued a statement that said the Commission was in fact aware of the Able Danger program, but that they had no information about Atta. They also said that they had actually been told that Atta was identified by the government by a Navy officer only days before the 9/11 Commission report was released. They argued that the officer, whom they interviewed, was unable to describe what information had led to this supposed Atta identification, nor could the interviewee recall, when questioned, any details about how he thought a link to Atta could have been made by this DoD program in 2000 or any time before 9/11. Essentially, they said that the information provided by the officer was unreliable and was not taken seriously, especially in light of the fact that the DoD had never given any information about the apparent knowledge of Atta. It's also notable that two other members of the commission told Weldon personally that they had not been briefed on Able Danger. Weldon was quick to jump on these apparent inconsistencies in the responses of the commission members, saying the 9/11 Commission has released multiple statements over the past week, each of which has significantly changed, from initially denying ever being briefed to acknowledging being briefed on both Operation Able Danger and Mohammed Atta. The information was omitted primarily because they found it to be suspect despite having been briefed on it 2 times by 2 different military officers on active duty. Additionally, the 9/11 Commission also received documents from the Department of Defense on Able Danger. Though Weldon's story was apparently not so airtight either. He claimed in his book that he had presented a chart produced by the Able Danger program to the then Deputy National Security Advisor, Stephen Hadley, in a personal meeting with him shortly after the 9/11 attacks. He claims this chart included 4 of the 9/11 hijackers, including Atta. However, it seems that he later stated that he was unsure if Atta's name was actually on the chart, unable to verify because he gave his only copy of the chart to Hadley. However, Weldon is not the only one who claimed that Atta was identified by Able Danger. A man who requested anonymity gave an interview with a New Jersey paper claiming to be Weldon's source and member of Able Danger. He claimed that they identified Atta and 3 of the other 9/11 hijackers, but were blocked by government lawyers from giving the information to the FBI. He also claimed that he was ignored by the 9/11 Commission 2 different times when he attempted to tell them about Able Danger's discoveries. Likewise, 4 other military employees, 3 officers, and 1 civilian contractors all came forth claiming to have information on Able Danger, corroborating Weldon's claims. One of them, Major Eric Kleinsmith, claimed to have been ordered to delete 2.5 terabytes of information on Able Danger. The DoD performed a 3-week-long investigation into Able Danger and published their findings on September 1st, 2005. They interviewed 3 other witnesses that all claimed to have either seen a photo of Atta and or knew of his name. The DoD argued that the alleged chart with Atta on it could have existed and been destroyed, but that they doubted that such a thing occurred. They stressed that Able Danger was nothing more than a 15-month planning effort, and that the effort never targeted specific individuals, but was used to determine vulnerabilities and linkages among and within Al-Qaeda. In a congressional hearing on September 21st, 2005, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer, one of the most outspoken members of Able Danger who claimed foreknowledge of Atta, was represented by attorney Mark Zaid, who clarified that Schaefer and the other members were not claiming that Able Danger was aware that Atta was in the United States, and that they only knew of him by his possible association with other suspects. He argued that Able Danger was not designed to address the question of if Atta's associations were innocuous or nefarious. He did say that there was a seemingly obstructionist attitude within the DoD regarding the destruction of the information on the early identification of Atta, and that this was worthy of further investigation. In September of 2006, the Deputy Inspector General for Investigations reported that Schaefer had been put on leave and that when his office was stripped of any classified documents, no Able Danger-related documents were found. The Senate Intelligence Committee letter on Able Danger determined that no such chart with Atta's face and name on it existed. They interviewed a member of Weldon's staff who claimed that she had given him the chart with Atta's face on it, but that it was a post-9/11 construction. They also claimed that the National Security Council staff told the committee that the Mr. Hadley that Weldon claims to have shown the pre-9/11 chart to in the days after the attack had no recollection of any charts with pre-9/11 data about Atta in his meeting with the congressman. The committee said that there was no legitimate evidence that military lawyers denied Able Danger contact with the FBI. The summary at the end of the letter reads, "The Inspector General concluded that prior to September 11, 2001, Able Danger team members did not identify Mohammed Atta or any other 9/11 hijacker. The Inspector General also found that testimony from witnesses who claimed to have seen a chart which contained the picture and or name of Mohammed Atta varied significantly from each other. And in some instances, testimony from witness re-interviews was inconsistent with the testimony those witnesses had provided earlier. The Inspector General also found no evidence to corroborate the claims of witnesses that Able Danger team members were prohibited from sharing information with the FBI, or that Able Danger data was improperly destroyed." As you can see, this one runs pretty deep. Weldon's original conviction that the situation was due to incompetence isn't entirely unbelievable, and he has a fair amount of witnesses to support his case, but the evidence overall is somewhat wonky. Obviously, the DoD determined that all of it was false, and that no such information about Atta was known before 9/11. It seems unlikely that such information existed in the hands of the DoD only for it to never be given any attention either before or after the attacks. The 9/11 Commission was not afraid to point out failures and incompetencies on the part of the US in their report, and as always, any kind of alleged conspiracy would require a lot more evidence. Silverstein Properties Terrorism Response Meeting months before 9/11. This entry is likely in reference to the theories surrounding the property owner of the World Trade Center at the time, Larry Silverstein. Silverstein, the head of a consortium of businessmen, signed a 99-year, $3.2 billion lease for the World Trade Center in July of 2001, just 2 months before the attacks. It is very commonly stated that just weeks before, he bought terrorism insurance for the complex, was then conveniently not present for the attacks, and went on to be paid out $4.55 billion from the insurance company. The truth of all that is a bit more complicated than it seems. First of all, the idea of purchasing terrorism insurance is made to sound very suspicious and convenient, but one needs to remember that first of all, Silverstein only bought the complex 2 months before the attacks. Anything he did with the buildings was bound to be very close in time to the attacks. Second, terrorism insurance isn't what it sounds like. This excerpt from a Snopes article on the topic explains, when we speak of terrorism insurance coverage, what we're actually speaking of is coverage that doesn't have a terrorism exclusion. Such exclusions aren't uncommon now, but according to the Insurance Information Institute, virtually all commercial insurance policies sold in the US before 9/11 covered terrorist incidents as a matter of course, and essentially free of charge, because the risk was considered so remote. Thus, for example, the World Trade Center was fully covered when it was bombed by terrorists in 1993, and insurers paid out an estimated $510 million in damages after that incident. There's no reason to suppose that the World Trade Center wasn't routinely covered against terrorist acts right up until the time Silverstein took over the lease in 2001. Frankly, even if terrorism insurance wasn't a common part of any such coverage, it wouldn't exactly be surprising that the target of a previous attack would be insured for such an occurrence. The 1993 bombing was almost 10 years past in 2001, but it wasn't as though people simply forgot. As for the amount of money Silverstein was paid out after taking the insurance company to court, this likewise is not proof of some kind of fraudulent or even opportunistic behavior. Silverstein did not sell off the complex, but kept the lease and went on to begin the plans of rebuilding all of it. Those billions of dollars did not simply go into Silverstein's pocket, but were put towards the rebuilding of the World Trade Center. Another eerie detail commonly parroted is one originally reported the day after the attacks by the New York Times in an article about the damage costs of the day prior. They wrote, Mr. Silverstein's company had planned a meeting yesterday morning on the 88th floor of one tower to discuss what to do in the event of a terrorist attack. The meeting was cancelled Monday night because one participant could not attend. I can't seem to find any corroborating evidence for this, or any known source besides this one that actually backs this up. I sort of assumed that this was one of those baseless conspiracy claims, but it was indeed reported in a pretty casual manner in a legitimate paper. The article includes this tidbit at the very end, likely to spice up the otherwise dry content about damage costs. If this claim is true, it is an insane and eerie coincidence. It may be more likely that this was false information provided to the Times, and that it was simply one of the hundreds of lucrative and exciting urban legends that began spreading the very day of the attacks. Missing polygons on CGI United Airlines 175. This entry refers to a video angle that people online claim exposes the faulty CGI of the second plane. The footage in question shows a direct view of United 175 impacting the South Tower. People online have noticed that in the video, the left wing of the plane seems to disappear right before the moment of the crash. This is another one of these theories that just feels really hard to talk about. Obviously, the video is low quality as is, and people tend to pick on the particularly poor quality versions of this video. The plane being shot against the gray smoke and gray building, plus the inherently low resolution, make the left wing blend in with the background. There's not really much else to say. In layer 2, we talked about the CGI/hologram theory a bit more. I don't feel it's necessary to insult your intelligence as the viewer by explaining why this is a ridiculous theory. Ejection of material. This entry is referring to the fact that when the towers were collapsing, visible material and puffs of dust were being ejected from the sides of the building. In the book Painful Questions, an analysis of the September 11th attack, author Eric Hufschmind states, "The concrete clouds shooting out of the buildings are not possible from a mere collapse. They do occur from explosions," implying that these puffs of debris are indications of explosions occurring throughout the building. That is, a controlled demolition. The common explanation is that as the tower is collapsing, the floors below are getting smashed in by the weight of the ones above. These areas that seem to be explosions are just a combination of that and air pressure in the building pushing debris and concrete dust out of the building, not explosives. 9/11 was scripted. This entry refers to the very basic idea we've pretty much already covered. Many people believe that the events of September 11th were part of a master plan, that the attacks were following a script. There are many different variations of this idea. The idea is that the government perpetrated the attacks in order to reach a political goal, and that everything happened according to a pre-planned course of events. Israeli agents. On the day of the attacks, a woman reported to the FBI that she had seen 3 men on the roof of a white van in her apartment building parking lot, taking pictures or videos of the burning World Trade Center. What was strange to the woman was the fact that the men seemed to be celebrating. Being so alarmed by their behavior, she recorded the van's license plate and reported the incident to the FBI. At 4 p.m. that day, the same van was pulled over by a policeman in New Jersey. Inside the van, which belonged to the company Urban Moving Systems, were 5 men. The men turned out to all be Israeli citizens, the driver of the van telling police, "We are Israeli. We are not your problem. Your problems are our problems. The Palestinians are the problem." All 5 men were held in custody for several months before being deported. 2 of them were originally suspected to be connected to the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad, though this was later determined to be unprovable. Likewise, it was suspected that the company, Urban Moving Systems, was, quote, set up or exploited for the purpose of launching an intelligence operation against radical Islamists in the area, particularly in the New Jersey, New York area. An ABC article reporting on the story from June of 2002 states, after the 5 men were arrested, the FBI got a warrant and searched Urban Moving's Weehawken, New Jersey offices. The FBI searched Urban Moving's offices for several hours, removing boxes of documents and a dozen computer hard drives. The FBI also questioned Urban Moving's owner. His attorney insists that his client answered all of the FBI's questions, but when FBI agents tried to interview him again a few days later, he was gone. 3 months later, 2020's cameras photographed the inside of Urban Moving, and it looked as if the business had been shut down in a big hurry. Cell phones were lying around, office phones were still connected, and the property of dozens of clients remained in the warehouse. The owner had also cleared out of his New Jersey home, put it up for sale, and returned with his family to Israel. Essentially, the major concern here is that the Israeli men were seen celebrating and filming the attacks as they happened. This is where the oft-repeated phrase, dancing Israelis, comes from in regards to this story. The men were in fact illegally in the country and had suspected ties to Mossad, though the latter detail has never been fully verified. Based on what the men told police and the general attitude Israel had regarding the attacks, it appears the men may have been celebrating that the US would finally become more involved in the Middle East. This implies that the men were aware that the attacks were perpetrated by Islamic terrorists. The FBI concluded that the men had no foreknowledge of the attacks, yet many theorists to this day are unconvinced. It should also be noted that commonly tied to this event is a picture of a supposed urban moving van, with a mural of a plane crashing into the Twin Towers. However, not only was this not mentioned in any of the official official news reports or government investigations, the van in this image is not even the same van the men were operating. Oh, and the image is photoshopped. Huge thanks to RamtroStudios for pointing out these details. It would be pretty insane if they were driving around the city in a van with a printed mural depicting the attacks before they even happened, but this is just a fictional claim. Flight 93 was shot down. As discussed in the earlier layers, one of the most common theories regarding the attacks is that Flight 93 was actually shot down. There are many variations of this theory. Some theorists believe that it was shot down by US fighter jets to mitigate the very real threat of it being a hijacked plane. The idea here is that it being shot down was covered up in order to reduce the controversy of an American fighter shooting down an American, hijacked or not, passenger plane. In this view, the passenger revolt narrative was conjured to increase morale, for lack of a better phrase. This is obviously false, and there is literally zero evidence for it being true. In fact, there is abundant evidence to the contrary. The same goes for the more ridiculous version of the theory in which the plane was simply shot down for dramatic effect. Some people believe the crash site itself is indicative of a shot down plane, which is also demonstrably untrue. Essentially, the idea behind this theory is that for whatever reason, the passenger revolt story was made up and the plane, whether hijacked or not, was shot down. Not much to say here. 9/11 was a rebrand of Operation Northwoods. Operation Northwoods was a false flag operation proposed in 1962 by the Joint Chiefs of Staff that suggested CIA operatives stage and perform attacks of terrorism in and around the US military and civilian areas. The attacks would be blamed on Cuba in order to justify war with the country. The plans, which had been fully unclassified and are available online, read, "Since it would be desirable to use legitimate provocation as the basis for military intervention in Cuba, a cover and deception plan to include requisite preliminary actions such as has been developed." Some well-coordinated incidents proposed in the plan include staged attacks on and around Guantanamo Bay and a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. A section of the plan mentions the arrangement of a Remember the Maine incident, referring to the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana's harbor in Cuba in 1898, which was blamed on Spain and used to justify the Spanish-American War. Under this very section, we could blow up a US ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. A large portion of the document proposes various false flag attacks involving planes and stage hijackings. The plan was ultimately rejected by President Kennedy. Naturally, such a very real and proven proposal on the part of the DoD is terrifying, to say the least. While many find it hard to believe because of the true absurd nature of it all, the Joint Chiefs of Staff came to the President with a straight face with a plan to stage attacks on civilians from Florida to as far as Washington in order to justify a war with Cuba. To those who already believe that the September 11th attacks were an inside job, the fact that the US has openly admitted to planning something not dissimilar to 9/11 back in the 60s is pretty satisfying evidence. The argument is that just as the US was prepared to stage acts of terror and blame it on the people they wanted to invade in the case of Cuba, the US did the same thing with the September 11th attacks and the subsequent wars that followed them. Obviously, there is no direct evidence for these two things being connected, but the idea isn't hard to grasp. World Trade Center 7 was left to burn. As has been alluded to a couple of times throughout the Iceberg, the controlled demolition theory extends beyond just the collapse of the Twin Towers. As most people are aware, the World Trade Center was an entire complex with multiple different buildings. One of these buildings was World Trade Center 7, a 47-story office building in the complex. Building 7 collapsed at 5:20 p.m. after burning for 7 hours. Theorists often point to the apparently suspicious nature of the building's collapse, citing that it collapsed like a controlled demolition despite not being hit by any plane, the fact that it was the first steel frame high-rise building to collapse because of a fire in history, and the fact that it was seemingly left to burn all day. They point to the fact that the building housed multiple federal agencies, insinuating that it was demolished on purpose to cover up whatever information was held within it. A popular quote comes from the building owner Larry Silverstein, who on the day of the attack said, "I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire, and I said, we've had such a terrible loss of life, maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made the decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse." Theorists point to the fact that Silverstein said "pull it," implying that this refers to some kind of indication to trigger whatever directly caused the collapse. If the building truly was intentionally demolished with pre-placed explosives of some kind, and there was a massive plot and cover-up at play, it doesn't really make sense that Silverstein would simply let it slip so casually that he literally gave the order to demolish the building. It's much more likely that Silverstein was referring to removing the firefighters from the building to avoid any more casualties, giving up on the futile attempt to save the building. This is explicitly indicated in his own quote, in which he laments the quote loss of life and correlates the decision to pull it with the intention of preventing any further loss of life, even if that meant losing the building. Bin Laden videos. The time immediately following 9/11 left the American people and the world wondering who was responsible. Contrary to what many people might assume, Osama bin Laden did not immediately claim the attack as his own. A statement alleged to be from bin Laden given to a Qatar-based radio station just days after the attacks said, "The US government has consistently blamed me for being behind every occasion its enemies attack it. I would like to assure the world that I did not plan the recent attacks, which seems to have been planned by people for personal reasons. I have been living in the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and following its leader's rules. The current leader does not allow me to exercise such operations." President Bush responded to this statement by saying, "No question, he is the prime suspect. No question about that." In December 2001, the US claimed to have received a video found in a home in Jalalabad, Afghanistan. The video, a 40-minute, poor-quality recording, allegedly showed Osama bin Laden confessing to the 9/11 attacks. The footage was broadcast on December 13th in the US along with English subtitles. The English translation has bin Laden commenting on the premeditated nature of the attacks, the estimated casualties, floors that would be hit, and the fact that, though the hijackers knew they were participating in a quote, martyrdom operation, they did not know the full details of the plan until just before they boarded the planes. The footage was met with immediate suspicion. People claimed that the footage was made using a bin Laden look-alike or with computer-generated effects. Critics cited the fact that the bin Laden in the video was heavier set and had darker skin than the real bin Laden, as well as the fact that he appears to have been wearing a gold ring, something uncharacteristic of bin Laden. Besides this, a German television channel analyzed the footage, comparing their translation of the Arabic with that of the Pentagon's. The translators noted several places where the English subtitles simply did not agree with the Arabic, adding in suggestions of foreknowledge on bin Laden's part where there were none. Professor Gernot Rotter, an Islamic and Arabic scholar, said, "Regardless of whether bin Laden himself, organizationally, was actively involved in the attacks or not, this tape is of such poor quality that in some places it cannot be understood at all, and what can be understood is often taken out of context so that no evidence can be constructed from it. The American translators who listened to and transcribed the tapes obviously wrote things into them in many places, which they wanted to hear, but which, even after listening to them several times, cannot be heard." President Bush responded to the mass wave of skepticism by saying that it was, quote, preposterous for anybody to think this tape was doctored, as well as saying, "Those who contend it's a farce or a fake are hoping for the best about an evil man. This is bin Laden unedited." Many other videos and audio recordings would surface in the years leading up to bin Laden's death that contained his open confessions. Despite this, many people to this day deny that bin Laden was involved at all, or at least deny that he was the mastermind behind the attacks. The idea is that bin Laden was used by the United States as the scapegoat for the attacks, and that the initial confessions that were released in late 2001 were fabricated in order to justify the war in Afghanistan. More planes, and fifth plane couldn't be hijacked. There is a long-standing theory that there were more than 4 planes intended to be involved in the 9/11 attacks. The crew of United Airlines Flight 23 claimed to this day that their plane carried would-be hijackers who bailed out due to an unexpected delay. This theory is not so much related to the realm of inside job speculations, and made it to as mainstream of a platform as a TMZ documentary released in 2023 titled 9/11: The Fifth Plane. The Capitol was a target. Another one of the most mainstream and ultimately uncontroversial theories regarding the attacks is that Flight 93's hijackers had the Capitol building or some other building in DC as their target. There is really no solid evidence for what exactly the target was, but obviously the plane had some intended target that it never reached. Mega powers destroy Twin Towers. There was a WWF wrestling storyline from the late 80s that involved 2 teams, the Mega Powers, consisting of Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan, and the Twin Towers, consisting of Big Boss Man and Akeem. In 1989, the 2 teams fought against each other. Here are some clips from the pre-fight interviews. Hogan and Savage, that is, the Mega Powers, did end up defeating the Twin Towers team in the fight. Obviously, this match has not aged well. People point to the emphasis on terrorist attack and the repeated phrases referring to the destruction of the Twin Towers as foreshadowings of the attack. Mega Powers being a cheeky reference to the elite powers that orchestrated the attacks, and Twin Towers representing, of course, the actual Twin Towers. Security camera footage. Despite there being so many different amateur and news recordings of the 9/11 attacks, there is apparently an abundant amount of security camera footage possessed by the FBI that has never been released. The World Trade Center complex was littered with security cameras, and many make the claim that the FBI seized almost all of this and are currently holding onto it for trial-related purposes. A similar claim is made about the Pentagon security footage, with a number as high as 85 unreleased recordings floating around. In regards to the Pentagon, the official response seems to be that the FBI has released all relevant footage, that being the 2 security camera recordings that show the very low frame rate footage of the plane's impact from virtually the same angle each. The remaining footage is allegedly just recordings from around the area that were running but not pointed towards the impact zone. As for the World Trade Center, information on this seems to be very little. Either the footage does not exist and/or was not retrieved, or whatever existed was retrieved and has never been released. I was unable to find any official statements from the government on this topic, but there might be one out there. The point is, as with all these theories, people suggest that this alleged secrecy surrounding this missing footage is part of some government cover-up. There is no explicit evidence for this. Alex Jones' prediction. In a broadcast from July 25, 2001, Alex Jones explained suspicions he had that the government was going to stage a false flag attack. He cited the World Trade Center as a possible target, likely because of the 1993 attacks, which he also believed to be a federal operation. He also mentioned that Osama bin Laden was the boogeyman that they needed, and made reference to the plan from Operation Northwoods to use airliners in terrorist attacks. Jones encouraged his viewers to call the White House and tell them that the people are aware of these plans, and that if these attacks happen, they will know who to blame. This prediction made by Jones received new attention when clips of it were played and discussed in his recent interview with Tucker Carlson. Gentle warning, clips of this are frequently deleted. Predictive programming / foreshadowing. Predictive programming refers to the idea that there is a precedent among the powers that be to intentionally slip foreshadowing of future events into the media. This was first defined by a researcher named Alan Watt, who said, "Predictive programming is a subtle form of psychological conditioning provided by the media to acquaint the public with planned societal changes to be implemented by our leaders. If and when these changes are put through, the public will already be familiarized with them and will accept them as natural progressions, thus lessening possible public resistance and commotion." A quick Google search will reveal the unbelievable mass of apparent displays of predictive programming regarding the September 11th attacks. There is a truly insane amount of pictures and videos from advertisements, television shows, movies, cartoons, games, and almost every kind of media you can think of that show the number 9/11, the Twin Towers either being destroyed, being approached by a plane, or in some cases actually being destroyed by a plane. The examples range from people simply reaching to genuinely eerie. For whatever reason, many cartoons in the 90s had scenes of the Twin Towers being destroyed, and a lot of advertisements, particularly travel ones, paired the towers with images of planes. Some of the more famous ones are the images from the Illuminati playing card game, this image from The Simpsons, and the convoluted connections noted in Back to the Future's Twin Pine Mall plotline. Probably the most baffling example of a piece of media predicting the 9/11 attacks has to be the first episode of the X-Files spin-off series, The Lone Gunman. In the pilot episode, the characters discover a plot within a faction of the US government to stage a false flag attack in order to blame it on foreign terrorists and increase arms trading. The false flag attack in the story is terrorist hackers remotely taking control of a fully loaded jetliner and crashing it into the World Trade Center. The episode contains extremely eerie moments where the characters seem to say verbatim what would happen in only a few months in real life. The episode aired March 2nd, 2001.
You're saying our government plans to commit a terrorist act against a domestic airline?
There you go. Indicting the entire government as usual. It's a faction. A small faction.
For what possible gain?
The Cold War's over, John. But with no clear enemy to stockpile against, the arms market's flat. But bring down a fully loaded 727 into the middle of New York City, and you'll find a dozen tin-pot dictators all over the world just clamoring to take responsibility and begging to be smart-bombed.
I can't believe it. This is about increasing arms sales.
Corner of Liberty and Washington. Lower Manhattan.
World Trade Center. We're going to crash the plane into the World Trade Center.
I'll tell the flight crew.
Finally, we're getting close. New York Center. This is Atlantic National Flight 265.
Most of the examples of predictive programming are pretty obviously coincidental. Consider how many movies and shows depict the Statue of Liberty or the Eiffel Tower being destroyed. Movies that depict disasters and destruction typically show recognizable landmarks being destroyed for dramatic emphasis. Before the attacks, the Twin Towers weren't known for being destroyed. They were known because they were the tallest and most recognizable buildings in America, if not the world. For that reason alone, unfortunate coincidence seems to be the answer. Let's say they really were put there to intentionally foreshadow the attacks. Who is in charge of slipping these random, often unnoticeable images into what, compared to the totality of media, amounted to a relatively small number of cases? Was there somebody in charge of the 9/11 foreshadowing in The Simpsons animation crew? Were travel agencies coerced into pairing imagery of planes next to the towers, or were the towers simply a landmark in brochures to represent the tourist attraction of the whole city? While many of these examples do seem very strange, it seems much more simple that they were nothing more than coincidences rather than a massive plot to pre-program the nation, a plan that, by the way, did not work, considering the American public did not see it coming and were shocked beyond measure by the attacks. All of that being said, certain examples seem almost too close to be coincidence. The Lone Gunman episode is probably the most insane and direct example of what must be assumed as unintentional foreshadowing. It's interesting and convenient for theorists that not only did the episode present a story about terrorists crashing a plane into the Twin Towers, but a story about the government staging said terrorist attack. Trump prediction. Similar to the Alex Jones prediction, Donald Trump predicted the attacks in his 2000 book, The America We Deserve. He wrote, "I really am convinced we're in danger of the sort of terrorist attack that will make the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center look like kids playing with firecrackers." Regarding the Clinton administration's foreign policy, he wrote, "One day we're told that a shadowy figure with no fixed address named Osama bin Laden is public enemy number one, and US jet fighters lay waste to his camp in Afghanistan. He escapes back under some rock, and a few news cycles later it's on to a new enemy at a new crisis." While his prediction wasn't quite as pointed or conspiratorial as the one posited by Alex Jones, it goes to show that people were definitely afraid of the possibility of a large-scale terrorist attack, and bin Laden was in the public mind as a threat to national security. Kevin Wesley foreknowledge. Kevin Wesley is the name of an individual who recorded one of the many angles of the second plane's impact. Filmed from a ferry, the footage includes a remarkable tracking shot of the plane's approach and subsequent impact, with the vocal reactions of people around the camera. While this may seem normal so far, there are a handful of details that make this particular footage unique. First of all, the original description claimed that the video was uploaded in 2001, but accidentally left private until February 24th, 2022. The obvious issue is that YouTube did not even exist until 2005. The video's description was edited and now reads more vaguely as "in the 2000s" rather than specifically 2001. Wesley worked for the United States Air Force as well as for Boeing, and was apparently involved in a number of experimental aviation projects. One of his videos, a slideshow of his time in Iraq shown at his retirement ceremony, is titled Horned Owl, possibly in reference to the Great Horned Owl Project, a national intelligence project aimed at developing technologies that significantly extend the operational endurance and payload capabilities of unmanned drones. The overall implication is that it is not a coincidence that this engineer involved in high-level projects in the military and Boeing just happened to record some of the most clear footage of 9/11, as well as essentially lie about when he uploaded it. The idea is that somehow all of this is some kind of admittance of involvement in the attacks, and the role of the government in orchestrating it. This seems to be reaching a bit, but Kevin Wesley's channel is very cryptic and perhaps deserves its own video. The 1981 Near Miss. In 1981, an Argentinian airliner nearly crashed into the World Trade Center after accidentally flying too low on a descent towards the JFK airport. There's no conspiracy theory here, or too much to even comment on, other than the fact that this is a crazy thing to have almost happened. Gold underneath the Twin Towers. One of the lesser-known facts about the aftermath of the attacks is that beneath the rubble was hundreds of millions of dollars of precious metals stored by banks within the World Trade Center. During the cleanup process, officials noticed a basement door with scorch marks on it, indicating that somebody had tried to break into the room. Behind the door was over 1,000 tons of gold and silver. It's pretty fascinating to think that somebody had the idea to sneak into the midst of the rubble and pull off a heist of that magnitude. All of the precious metals underneath the complex were eventually removed by officials. Proof in plain sight. Proof in plain sight refers to the simple belief that all of these things mentioned so far serve as obvious proof that something is fishy about all of it. The foreshadowing in the media, the predictions of people both in and out of government, the alleged connections between the terrorists and the US before the attacks, the collapse of the towers, and the foreign policy shift after are all things that make theorists confident in their position that 9/11 was an inside job. Obviously, this video is not in support of this conclusion, and many of these entries have hopefully been shown to be misleading. However, believing all or some combination of these theories lead many people to believe there are hidden truths beneath the rubble that contradict the official story. But that is just a theory.